Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining. I'm going to give it 30 seconds or so to allow people to jump on this webinar. So if you wouldn't mind just sitting tight for half a minute or so, and then we shall kick off proceedings. Right, let's get started. Thank you very much everyone for joining the second instalment of our webinar series looking at the research impact of NCC Group over the last 25 years or so. I am Ro Johnstone-Hulse and I shall be your host today. I am the Government Affairs Lead at NCC Group and have had the pleasure over the last 4 years or so of working with all of our different research teams to project the findings of our research into the wonderful world of government policy making. Having taken a gander at the attendee ticker and who had kind of previously signed up to join this webinar, I think there's quite a few of you that will be very familiar with NCC Group because you're part of our alumni network. However, if you don't know who we are, NCC Group is a people-powered, tech-enabled, full-spectrum cybersecurity services provider. We cover the full life cycle of cyber services, right through from incident response to technical security testing, consulting and implementation, and managed detection and response. And I think it's fair to say across all of those different services and products, we are underpinned by all of the research that we do here at NCC Group and have done so over the past 25 years. It's properly in our DNA and totally important when we're operating in a space that is moving as fast as cybersecurity does, and as fast as the threat and technological landscapes move too. And I'm very proud to work for an organisation where our research is consistently impacting the real world day to day, and that really is the topic of today's discussion and webinar. For those of you who missed it, we ran the first instalment of this webinar series last week, looking at the technical outputs from our research. It was, if we may say so, a brilliant watch, and I'd highly recommend going back and tuning in if you didn't manage to make it. If you do, you'll hear some brilliant war stories and some hilarious analogies from our very own Chris Anley, including comparing the discovery of format strings to seeing a dinosaur in Richmond Park, as well as referring to some security research techniques that are as timeless as the little black dress. So a brilliant session, and I highly recommend going back to watch if you haven't already. But on to today's topic of research impact. This one will be a little bit more high level than last week, so not so technical. But there are, of course, many ways in which we could talk about the way in which NCC Group's research has impacted the real world. But what we've tried to do is frame it around 3 key areas. So we're going to look at the impact on safety, impact on citizens, and then finally the impact on the wider community, before looking ahead to the future. And there should be time for Q&A at the end. And to walk us through all of that, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by 2 of my very favourite colleagues, our Chief Scientist, Chris Anley, and our Research Director, Andy Davis, who have both appeared as if by magic, exactly as I've summoned them. So that's worked wonderfully. Nice to see you both. I think we could probably have a webinar about each of your careers, just kind of purely dedicated to that subject. But just to kind of give us a flavour of who you are and the kind of work that you do, I thought maybe just to kick us off, what you could do is think about an example of the work that you could share with the audience where you use this example when you're at a family barbecue and you want to convey to your granny or some random cousin that you've just met what it is that you actually do for a day job and why they should care about it. So what's that one moment or project that you think about and share with your family and friends to be able to say, this is what I do, and this is why it's really important. Maybe Andy, I'll come to you first on that question, if I may.
Thanks, Ro, and hi everyone. Really glad to be here. So I've been fortunate to have 2 opportunities of being research director at NCC. When I first joined back in 2010, I was research director, and then I took a break out for 8 years to run the transport practice. The first time I was research director, I spent quite a lot of time doing USB research, and some of that USB research resulted in some findings that were reported to Apple to do with vulnerabilities in the iPhone. And a lot of people don't realize that when you plug a USB device into your phone or into your computer, there's a lot of communication that goes on and a lot of opportunity for security vulnerabilities, many of which we found in the early days and reported to the likes of Apple. To the point where in 2018, Apple created a mitigation technology called restricted mode, which means that if people with clever rogue techniques involving plugging devices into your iPhone while you're not looking, if your phone's been locked for over an hour, it will stop talking to anything that's plugged in and prevent any kind of rogue techniques as a result of people plugging stuff into your phone. Now, I'm not claiming that I was the sole contributor that resulted in Apple introducing this mitigation technology. There were many people looking at USB vulnerabilities and reporting them to people like Apple. But if I'm going to talk about impact, there are 1.3 billion iPhones in the world that are running USB restricted mode. So, I think that we've done a reasonable job at helping to protect people using their smartphones from people trying to tamper with them.
Awesome. That is very, very cool. I mean, Chris, how about you? Have you got an example that you use to communicate the importance of cybersecurity research? That's the equivalent of 1 billion smartphones in terms of its impact.
Yeah, it's kind of tricky to beat that, isn't it? Like, wow, that's a sizable portion of humanity. So no, I mean, what I generally say to people is that I break into banks for a living, and with their permission, of course. And then some people are like, oh, that's interesting, explain how that. But quite increasingly, in recent years especially, people have said, oh, you're in cybersecurity. It's like, oh yeah, yeah. And they sort of, they've twigged me. I'm not Keanu Reeves. I'm just a nerd, kind of thing. But then we then have a sort of more interesting conversation about, because everybody's being touched by these incidents at the moment, ransomware incidents, hacks in general. Everybody gets suspicious emails inviting them to click on something, attempts at fraud, robocalls and stuff like that. So we can then have a more interesting and sort of helpful discussion about what scams look like, the fact that anyone can be hacked, the way that we communicate to boards about, the first message is everybody in your organization, including the board, needs to know that everyone can be hacked. And then, break down how these scams work. So authority, urgency, and an action that they want you to take. So, it might be a message purporting to be from HMRC saying, you must pay this fine now. The action is to pay this amount of money to this account. And then increasingly, the way this is changing with things like AI is that the authority, it used to be good enough to send someone a letter through the post with headed notepaper or whatever. Now we're increasingly seeing deep fakes, voice cloning, the FBI warning about relative in distress fraud from voice cloning, where, a younger relative will phone up and say, I need money urgently or whatever. So you can just get into a more interesting discussion with people now that people kind of know a bit about what's going on. The problem with my career is that most of it's very deeply technical in the weeds. And so it's quite difficult to actually communicate, in the way that Andy can, because a lot more of Andy's stuff sort of touches devices that we hold in our hands or things that we trust our lives to, like cars. So, yeah. But yeah, breaking into banks is a good opening way to introduce the discussion, I think.
Very good. And I think hopefully the way in which we try to frame the discussion today, Chris, will help you kind of solidify how you communicate that impact piece. So on that note, let's get into the meat of the discussion. I should say that there is a question function. Please, if you've got any questions for Chris and Andy throughout the session, please do drop them into the chat. We have time for questions at the end, but equally I might just bring them in to the conversation depending on where we are with the topics. Our first topic that we're going to talk about is safety and the impact of NCC Group's research on that specific area. Andy, I know you have a very specific story to tell about setting trucks on fire. I don't think because you're an arsonist, but because I think it refers to a research project that has helped to demonstrate the importance of the work that we do in this specific area. How critical is it in a world of smart cities, cyber physical systems, a very kind of interconnected world? How important is it that we have cybersecurity research that is interlinked to this kind of safety agenda? And equally, you've obviously been our transport director for many, many years before taking on your current role. What lessons have you learned from the integration of safety and security from that role?
So any system where software can control physical, mechanical, or chemical processes has the potential to cause harm to people. So therefore, it's absolutely critical. And the potential impact has been shown in some public examples. So the first most popular example is the Stuxnet virus that had a physical effect on Iranian centrifuges. A slightly less well-known example was a blast furnace in Germany in 2014 that was hacked, and the attackers managed to get in as a result of a spear phishing email. So they targeted individuals, managed to get access to the right control systems, and shut down the blast furnace in a way that it wasn't supposed to be shut down. So in an uncontrolled way, and it caused huge amounts of physical damage and lots of money's worth of damage. So yeah, there are some, real world examples of where this can have safety impact. But I will tell the story about setting the truck on fire. Now you've teased about it. A few years ago, probably about 5 years ago, one of our clients asked if we could have a look at the security of their connected trucks. And there was quite a large attack surface to them because they'd integrated quite a lot of connected technology. They had a kind of telematics system that allowed the truck to be communicated with over the cellular network. But they also had many systems on board the truck that affect the physical aspects of the vehicle, one of which was to do with emissions. And it's a piece of technology that's not just found on trucks, it's found on diesel cars. Many people will have this device, and it's a particulate filter. It's a little device that's supposed to take the particles out of the diesel emissions. Now on a truck, there's quite sizable amounts of soot that gets created in this thing called a soot trap. And periodically, what's supposed to happen is a computer on board the truck will inject some fuel. It will then ignite the fuel, and then the fuel will go out having burnt off the soot. So it's kind of got rid of the problem. However, when we looked at it, we realized that there was one message that said start pumping the fuel in, and there was another message that said stop pumping the fuel in. So if you just kept sending the message saying keep pumping fuel in, keep pumping fuel in, eventually the device that the fuel was being pumped into would just explode, and fuel would spray all over the exhaust manifold. And if the truck was driving down the highway at the time, it would set the truck on fire. Unfortunately, they didn't let us set an actual truck on fire. We demonstrated it in a bucket, but we set a bucket on fire to prove the principle. And I think it was really quite impactful, and the client was very pleased that we managed to demonstrate it so that they could remediate that and no one could actually set any of their trucks on fire for real.
Sounds like an episode of Top Gear, doesn't it? Jeremy Clarkson trying to hack into trucks to kind of blow them up. But no, very, very serious message. And I know that the video of that Iranian attack or kind of attack in Iran is just one of those videos that in our engagement with kind of politicians, etc., is always something that springs to their mind as to the seriousness of cybersecurity and why we're seeing a lot of action at the moment to enhance standards across the board, particularly in that critical infrastructure space. Chris, if I could come to you next to talk about the buzzword of the last couple of years. We obviously hear a lot about how AI is going to be both a hindrance and a help in terms of our online security and safety. And obviously you've had the pleasure of giving evidence to a parliamentary select committee on this very subject. How do you see AI and machine learning interacting with security vulnerability research and broader cyber resilience as a whole? I mean, quite a large question, but you know, I'm sure you've got a short answer.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpick, and it's changing so rapidly. It almost seems like by the time I get to the end of my waffle, more waffle will be required, I'm afraid. But yeah, so the bottom line is I think AI helps defenders more than attackers. It's going to help us. It already is helping us to find security flaws, but it's going to help us more in the immediate future. In terms of large language models for security code review, the current state of the art is not great, and it is a relatively niche application, so it's not front of mind for those making frontier models at the moment as a capability they're being especially judged on. But they are getting better, and they're getting better at pace. So that's a positive impact. But then there's the security of AI, which is, again, a rapidly evolving field. The part that I think is of most practical interest is the security of AI infrastructure. So things like notebook applications that are used in data science, data components, data stores, messaging servers, message queues, all that sort of infrastructure. The various elements of AI pipelines, in other words. And one relatively recent element of this that's especially interesting is the Model Context Protocol, which is a framework to enable models to manipulate external tools and data. So this is at the heart of what's now being called agentic AI. And the tools that the models are connecting to are generally powerful, like programming languages, databases, command line interfaces, that sort of thing. And the data that's being operated on is also, certainly in a corporate setting or a government setting, is generally sensitive, perhaps under regulatory control. So that's an area that in our direct, experience today is of real interest to the cybersecurity community, I think. Certainly if you're a CISO or involved in the security function, it's something that is well worth having a look at now, because there is a lot of attack surface there, and the tooling and the research capability is lagging behind that particular exposure. So yeah, but I think the bottom line with AI is I think it helps defenders more than attackers, principally because the training data is much more oriented toward defense than attack, and the ways in which defenders want to use AI is it's more sort of in the current LLM sweet spot. So you get more bang per buck as a defender than an attacker at the moment. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks, Chris. And I think kind of shameless plug, but we recently held an AI webinar series that kind of explores some of these things in more detail. So please do check those out if you want to go down that route in more detail. We, a few years ago, acquired an organisation called Adelard, who are pretty well renowned for their expertise in safety. Maybe, Andy, I'll come to you on this question, but in terms of the I guess the opportunities and challenges of aligning the two different cultures, the kind of security culture and the safety culture, what do we see in this space? What lessons have we learned from our acquisition of Adelard?
It's really interesting. not just through speaking to Adelard, but speaking to engineers at clients, especially in the automotive space, who in the kind of early days of the automotive cybersecurity regulation, because of the lack of cyber talent available to them to recruit, their immediate choice of internal employees to look at cybersecurity was their functional safety team. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages of that because of the way that the two groups of people think and have been trained to think. So when we first started doing cybersecurity assessments on cars, speaking to functional safety people about what kept them up at night, about how their vehicles might be abused, was really, really interesting, because they had to design the systems to kind of test how robust certain things were. But the way that functional safety people generally think is about things that can fail as a result of hazards, rather than things that can fail as a result of people intentionally trying to tamper with them and get them to do things that they weren't designed to do. So you do have this interesting slant that safety people have and cybersecurity people have, but when you overlap the two, I think that the sum of the two is greater than the individual parts. So the fact that but by acquiring Adelard and bringing together functional safety engineers with cybersecurity engineers, I think has been a powerful way of demonstrating not only that do we think in slightly different ways, but when we think together, we can come up with some really powerful approaches to identifying where that crossover is and where the important effect on functional safety is by cybersecurity vulnerabilities.
It's so interesting as well, as I think to even consider kind of what does that mean for the way in which we train our engineers and we train our kind of cybersecurity specialists, and kind of what respective skills you need to build into some of those skills programs as well, so that they know how to talk to each other and kind of come out of academia with that level of understanding. No, thanks, Andy. That's great.
If I may, before we move on, I've got a great little story that kind of highlights the way that functional safety people think. We were working with an automotive vendor and spoke to their functional safety team that developed the setup that they use for testing all the different elements of their vehicle. So they had to simulate the car engine, and they'd done that in software. And through simulating the engine, they'd come up with a fantastic vulnerability that they'd discovered, whereby purely having access to the fuse box that was in the boot of the vehicle, they worked out that by unplugging and plugging in fuses in the right order, they could replicate the cranking profile of the engine and start the car. And I thought that was absolutely fantastic. That was really, really clever.
That is very cool. That's very James Bond, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very cool. Awesome. Thank you, guys. So I think we'll look at our second area of impact now. And I guess kind of a sad element of part of my day job doing government affairs is that often what puts cybersecurity on the radar of politicians or elected officials is when there is a major cyber attack that does impact directly on citizens or on their constituents in some way. So whether that's election infrastructure, or they can't get an appointment at their National Health Service. Obviously, the flip side of that is that the more research that we can do to identify vulnerabilities and make sure that kind of systems are designed with security in mind, the better that we can indeed protect citizens. And when I think about this area, the standout projects or kind of set of projects that come to mind for me is the work that we've done over the years with the consumer watchdog in the UK, which to identify vulnerabilities in smart home products, so that ultimately manufacturers and vendors can address those issues. And the work that we're doing is directly leading to people being safer in their own homes, which is just very awesome. Chris, if I come to you first on this subject, are there any standout projects from your side where you think, wow, we really had a massive impact on citizens, whether that's their data, whether it's, you know, their security and safety in the home, or something else entirely? So
obviously, I think most, if not everyone watching this will appreciate almost all of the work that we do, like high 90% of the work we do is under very strict NDA. So there's only a very limited number of things that we can actually talk about. But do you remember when there was that massive power outage across most of the UK internet and extended regions of Europe? No, nor do I, because we worked with vendors to fix security vulnerabilities that meant that those vulnerabilities were no longer present in those systems, and so the incidents didn't happen. So it's the incidents that haven't happened as a result of our research, which I think this is probably a cheating way to answer your question, but I think that's honestly, hand on heart, the most impactful thing that we've done. We've disclosed high hundreds, probably thousands at this point. If you want to check my working, Andy, I believe it's more than, we warrant multiple thousands now of vulnerabilities. We've worked with software vendors, with, you know, various organizations around the world to fix those vulnerabilities, responsibly disclose them, made sure they were patched. And, you know, that, how do you measure the incidents that didn't happen? It's very difficult. I mean, we can talk about bug counts, and NCC's right up there, as I've said. You could talk about severity. Again, a very large proportion of the bugs that we've found over the years have been critical. And then, so there's also the research into the vulnerability research into things that we hold in our hands, things that we trust our lives to. Some of the biometrics research that Matt Lewis has done, for example, our former research director, and some of the work that Andy's done that you mentioned earlier about, you know, in the transport practice, collaboration with Which Magazine, you know, IoT devices that are in people's homes, like your personal security of your house relates to these devices. Yeah, so I think, you know, over the years, the most impactful thing that we've done as an organization in terms of research for the public good and protecting citizens, I think, is preventing those incidents through our vulnerability research and also the broader research, you know, the white papers that we've published as well, I think.
Yeah, I totally take your point. It's so hard to, I guess, quantify the number of trucks that haven't exploded. Yeah. Andy, I'll come to you next on the topic of vulnerability disclosure. So, you know, there does need to be a level of trust between organizations that are providing a lot of these critical services and products that, you know, Chris is talking about, and the research community and also the public as well. They need to have trust in the way in which the system has been developed. You've recently overseen a refreshed NCC Group disclosure policy. What role do you see responsible disclosure practices playing in building that trust? And how has that kind of changed over the years in terms of the way in which researchers write, share, and publish findings, and how that's been kind of reflected in the updated framework that we've put out?
Yeah, so there's quite a range of shades of grey hat in our community, from the deeply black-hatted criminals through to white hat ethical hackers like ourselves. I think having a responsible disclosure policy clearly demonstrates that we wear white hats at NCC Group. And I think that's important for, you know, the trust relationship that we have with our clients and with vendors, and also with other members of the security research community. It's really important that there's trust between researchers and vendors, because historically, and unfortunately it's still the case in some instances, that there can be adversarial relationships sometimes between researchers and vendors. Fortunately, it's nowhere near as bad as it has been in the past. But developing that trust relationship with the vendors is really important to make sure that you have this kind of smooth process of not only disclosing the vulnerability, but helping them to patch the vulnerability and get that patch out quickly. And that comes to the trust between the vendors and the customers, because consumers need to be able to trust that vendors are taking vulnerabilities seriously that are being reported to them. They're not silently patching things. They're being transparent about when vulnerabilities have been disclosed, what the impact of those were, and how quickly they were able to remediate them. It is quite frustrating as a security researcher when you spend a long time diligently working out not only how exploitable a vulnerability is, but also providing real-world mitigation advice to a vendor, and then they silently patch it and don't give you any credit for it. So, you know, the trust between the researchers and the vendors is really important. With regard to, you know, how things are changing for the better, how things will change in the future, one thing that's become very clear in the last 5 to 10 years, and that's vendors are generally migrating towards either formalized vulnerability disclosure platforms or bug bounty platforms. Now, there are kind of pros and cons to that, but one of the big benefits to the vendor of having a formalized process, regardless of whether they're paying bounties or not to the researchers, is it formalizes the process and it formalizes the engagement between the reported vulnerability and their development teams. So when it comes to, you know, the process of patching and making sure that the appropriate people that develop the software have got the advice that's been provided by the security researchers, I think these kind of formalized vulnerability disclosure platforms are a good thing.
Awesome, thank you. And I guess in terms of, for I guess the uninitiated, you know, that you might not necessarily be super familiar with what goes into a disclosure policy, what are the kind of core elements that you would tend to look for in a strong policy, the kind of ethical framework, I guess, that governs stuff like this?
So the most important aspect is around making sure that appropriate mitigation advice has been provided by the vendor before disclosing any information to the public, because you've got to look at the motivation of disclosing vulnerabilities. What we're trying to do is make the software more secure for consumers. So there's absolutely no point in disclosing some cool exploit that you've developed if there's no mitigation for it, and you're literally just handing the blueprint for a weaponized exploit to the bad guys. So it's really important that you communicate the information securely with the vendor. You give the vendor appropriate time to mitigate that vulnerability, make the patch. But at the same time, you know, you need to be able to hold the vendor to account, and if they're not listening to you, they're trying to convince you that, oh, it's not really a vulnerability, you know, we don't need to patch this, we don't need to take it too seriously. You do need to have an avenue within your disclosure policy to accelerate that disclosure, but I really do think that's a kind of a last resort, because if you don't have the ability to at the same time reveal any kind of workaround or mitigation advice to limit the impact of it, you're probably doing the general public a disservice by putting that information in the public domain.
Yeah, it comes back to the kind of trust element, does it? Which I think leads us nicely on to our next area of questions, which is really around community and, you know, trust being an important part of the cybersecurity research community. But well, I guess one of the things that I'm very proud of as to work for an organisation like NCC is that we do a huge amount with the research community and really take our role as part of the wider ecosystem really, really seriously. Reflecting on that role within the community, Chris, if I can come to you, is there a specific example that comes to mind when you think about community collaboration working really well, whether it's led to a major kind of insight or tool or output? And how do events like hackathons and competitions, what role do they have within that sort of ecosystem?
Sure. So the community is very important, and so parts of this are automated. So indications of compromise, signatures of various different types of malware. Some of this will find its way into your network defensively. As soon as someone raises it in the community, you have that sort of immune system, which is a fantastic development of the past few years. But I think, true community research collaboration, you see it in things, in our own research publications. It's been apparent over the years in things like mitigations against true zero-day bugs, so bugs for which there is no patch and have been discovered by being used in anger in some sort of incident. So we will reverse engineer those exploits. We will, pick apart the methodology of whatever threat actor is involved. Cases of this you can see where we've contributed to that sort of research, as part of the community effort. Things like the Heartbleed issue in OpenSSL, where we published, research advice, detection signatures, architectural mitigations, ways that you can put things in front of things and what those things need to be. And the same is true of other sort of, very 5-alarm vulnerabilities like Shell Shock, Log4j, and all those sorts of things. And obviously, we do it ourselves for some vulnerabilities that we disclose. We'll talk about detection, mitigations, and so on of the sort that Andy's talking about. On the, again, community, but in terms of like hackathons and competitions and stuff. So we, as a company, compete. We've had representatives competing at, for example, Pwn2Own over the past few years. And this is a very valuable competition. If you haven't heard of it, it's definitely worth checking out, because it's pretty much at the cutting edge of vulnerability research and exploit development in particular, like the actual sharpest of sharp edges. Production quality kit, where this isn't a toy environment or a toy vulnerability. This is very much the real world. Obviously, we host internal hackathons, which we mostly can't talk about, but they tend to result in vulnerability disclosures of the type that we've been talking about, where we talk to the vendors, we work with the vendors to fix the vulnerabilities, and so on. But yeah, so recent Pwn2Own prizes, we should toot our horn. Pwn2Own Automotive 2025, Macaulay Hudson, Alex Plaskett, hacking an in-car infotainment system and an EV charger. This is important because the world is now full of EV chargers. The security of those devices is extremely important. And anyone who's driven a car made in the last few years will be aware of the potential privacy and security impacts of a compromise of your car's information systems. Several prizes there. And then in Pwn2Own 2024 in Ireland, NCC's own Ken Gannon successfully chained together 5 distinct vulnerabilities, which is the extent that you have to go to these days, 5 distinct vulnerabilities to compromise a Samsung Galaxy S24, for example. So the thing that's really valuable about these competitions is, like I say, it's the sharpest of the sharp edge. This is production kit. There's money at stake. There's prize money at stake in terms of the thing. Everyone's working extremely hard. And it really does give you, at the meta level, an understanding of what mitigations are working, whether they're working or not, how much effort it takes, because everyone presents on their findings, how much effort it really takes to exploit these vulnerabilities. And it sort of reveals certain universal truths, like it is still not only possible, but practical to exploit buffer overflows, even in 2025. It's difficult, but once one person's done it, that exploit can run around the world. So it's, the other thing, as Andy mentioned, we participate in bug bounty programs, so our researchers can participate in bug bounty programs. And that's a change that we've made, a policy change we've made, simply because this is the way that vulnerability research in the public interest is now moving. So we kind of, if we're going to do vulnerability in the public interest, which we do, we very much want to do that. That's sort of, you know, part of our history, and very much a thing that we're engaged with. We have to engage with bug bounty programs. So there's that element of working in public as well.
That's a really interesting point, and I think there is an element of trying to balance that working in the public interest with, you know, an increasingly commercialized landscape. So Andy, if I could come to you on this question, where vulnerability research is becoming more and more commercialized, what are the pros and cons of that, and what challenges come with trying to commercialize research without necessarily compromising the fundamental principles and ethics that have underpinned the way NCC Group has done research, the way others have done research, and the way it's evolved over the last few decades or so. So things like transparency, integrity. How do you kind of commercialize research without compromising those things?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that people can now become full-time independent cybersecurity researchers, being paid exclusively by bug bounty schemes. I imagine it's probably quite hard work, but if you find a vein of gold in the particular area that you're researching, it's perfectly possible. And I think commercializing it can attract real talent to focus their efforts, you know, at specifically finding very kind of high impact bugs. It does drive professionalism in the industry, as long as those researchers are submitting their bugs to the ethical end of the bug bounty market. There are always obviously the exploit brokers out there who aren't really that interested in reporting the vulnerability necessarily to the vendor so that it can be fixed, but selling it to the highest bidder. I think with it being more structured, as I mentioned before, with the kind of formalized vulnerability disclosure platforms, it enables vendors to fix things more quickly and more kind of systematically if it's kind of baked into their structure when they're signed up with a bug bounty scheme. As I touched on the cons side of things, if people are reporting these bugs to unscrupulous organizations that are selling bugs to the highest bidder, there's a good chance that the vulnerabilities and the associated exploits will be kind of proliferated around the place without an appropriate patch being created, and in some instances without the vendor being informed. So, you know, it's really important that people focus on the ethical side of vulnerability disclosure. One of the big challenges, even if people are reporting to some of the bug bounty schemes, is some of them will ask the researchers to sign NDAs, and those NDAs may contain restrictions that mean that the vulnerability researcher might not necessarily be given full details about where that information is sent to, and when a patch is produced, or if a patch is produced. So some of them are, you know, very much biased towards the bug bounty scheme rather than the security researcher. So I think it's really important for people engaging in bug bounty schemes to do so with their eyes open when it comes to being asked to sign NDAs, and look at the small print about, you know, what they're actually going to get out of that relationship with the bug bounty scheme. But yeah, all in all, I think it's a big improvement that the industry is becoming more professionalized, and I think the introduction of bug bounty schemes that are easily accessible to vendors has made vendors more likely to be able to engage with security researchers where they wouldn't have in the past. And I think maybe historically, sometimes vendors have not wanted to engage with security researchers because they not only did they not want to put effort into development where they didn't think development needed to be done, but maybe in some instances they didn't really understand the root cause of the problem. So it's important that communication with the security researchers is open and transparent in both directions, so that everybody understands what's been found, what the impact is, how it can be remediated. And once it's been remediated, make sure that the consumers know about it.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting intersection here, isn't there, with the legal frameworks and the fact that the majority of nations' computer laws were written before the internet was even a thing, and that so they could not have foreseen that there would be such a thing as an ethical cybersecurity research community that would be engaging in these sorts of practices, and as a result, in effect, criminalize cybersecurity research. And obviously, one of the ways in which NCC Group has contributed to the community over the years is through things like our campaign to reform the Computer Misuse Act in the UK and provide better legal protections in those circumstances for security researchers. Equally, to your kind of earlier point about the kind of exploit market, there's the really interesting Pall Mall process ongoing at the moment, which is looking at what the kind of legal and geopolitical boundaries are that can be put in place to, tackle the proliferation of offensive cyber capabilities. And I think it's a really tricky balance, isn't it, between ensuring that the industry is legitimately able to continue creating exploits for legitimate purposes, whilst also making sure that we crack down on some of that misuse and the kind of bad side that you were talking about, Andy. I guess a question for you, both of you, really. Maybe Chris, I'll come to you first. What's kind of, in your opinion, how do we create a responsible market for this sort of thing, and what is the role of governments in setting the boundaries for that?
Well, so bug bounty is, as Andy is saying, it's sort of a double-edged sword. It's probably a positive movement, but just to go back to a little bit of NCC history. So our former NCC colleague, Mark Litchfield, is by many metrics the world's #1 bug bounty hunter. He was the first to reach $500,000 in bounties, among the first to reach $1 million in bounties. And I think HackerOne gave him a sort of world heavyweight champion belt at a party in Vegas. So yeah, we have a long history with bug bounties, I think. I think it's a very positive move. As Andy says, there are some problems. I think ultimately, I think that the only way this can really go is if cybersecurity research in the public interest is protected by law, and it is in some territories. But just in terms of the UK for a moment, there are several reforms to the Computer Misuse Act that would be very helpful, that have been proposed by various parliamentarians. For example, adding a statutory defence related to actions in the public interest and actions to detect or prevent crime, which is the focus of the Cyber Up campaign, as I think most people listening to this call will hopefully know. If you're not familiar with the Cyber Up campaign and you're in the UK, you should definitely take a look and help out on that. I think the campaign has built a consensus. It's been raised in Parliament several times, and that consensus is growing. And I hope that in the immediate future, that we'll see some concrete action on that during this Parliament. And I think that will help, certainly in the UK. But more generally, worldwide, I think it's very important that cybersecurity research in the public interest is defended.
Yeah, absolutely. It won't surprise you, Chris, for me to say that I couldn't agree more with that statement. Andy, I guess, is anything to add from your side, and anything specifically on how we tackle that part of the market that's maybe operating in a much grayer area, shall we say, that is potentially not acting above board when they're looking to kind of sell exploits or sell commercial intrusion capabilities, and that end of the spectrum.
I mean, it all depends on how much government want to get involved in this. I think there are certainly things that they could do to help. So, for example, ethical incentives. They could potentially encourage the ethical markets that are, prioritizing defensive use over the exploit brokers. How they do that in real terms, not totally sure, but if they want to get involved, that's something they could potentially do. I think it's important that influence is put on the accountability of the vendors. So I kind of touched on this earlier, but it's really important that the vendors accept disclosures professionally. They patch in a reasonable time frame and don't do silent fixes. So if there's any kind of influence that government can have upon the vendors, I think that's important in that regard. And also, with all the different bug bounty schemes out there, I think it's important that the rewards to the security researchers are fair and consistent and transparent, so people understand what that marketplace actually looks like. And if they go to one bug bounty scheme over another, they're not going to get wildly different rewards for the same vulnerability that they disclose.
Awesome, thank you. Hopefully we've got a few policymakers listening in, so they can start scribbling away and coming up with new policies to support. Right, so we are now onto the section where we're thinking about the future. I'm coming straight back to you, Andy, if that's all right. What do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities for security research in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
So I could jump straight to AI and quantum, but I'm going to jump over those and talk about bio-cyber convergence, which is something that I'm absolutely fascinated by. There's various companies out there that have kind of started research into this area, looking at how computers and biology can interface, like human brains, for example. And also neuromorphic computing, which is basically trying to emulate biological functions inside a computer. And I think this whole area is going to be huge in the future. And the more and more successful it becomes, the more we need to be concerned about the protections around personal data and how we can protect information flowing between biological systems and computers. So kind of brain computer firewalls, if you like.
Crikey, I was when you first started speaking, Andy, I was quite pleased that you were jumping over AI and quantum. Now I am scared out of my wits, so not entirely helpful, but yeah, no, really interesting stuff. Thank you. Chris, for you, what would be your kind of one big bet on the future of the way in which security research is going to evolve, or the big challenge that's not people hacking into my brain that's coming up on the horizon?
So there's several factors, several things that are shifting, tides, if you will. There's AI, obviously. There's ransomware as a business model for cybercrime. There's bug bounty, and we've dealt with this, the way that vulnerability markets are functioning rather than disclosure for the public good, which is sort of the way it used to be, and non-disclosure. Back in the day, we had disclosure for the public good. There was also a lot of non-disclosure. So it's important to weigh those things. I think there needs to be a realignment, as we just said, a focus on protecting and encouraging vulnerability disclosure for the public good, including legal protections, as we've said. I think my big bet on cybersecurity in general, completely non-technical, but influenced by those factors, I think, is that ransomware payments will be made illegal through various routes within the next 5 years. And I think that this is just a result of the problem becoming so large, it's impacting society. And this means that it becomes a legislative and a regulatory issue. Governments will start using all the levers at their disposal to end it, including sanctioned entities, anti-terror legislation, and enacting new laws to make this illegal. We're already seeing movement in this general direction in the legislative space. So I'm effectively predicting the present rather than the future. But I think that's where we're going to end up within the next 5 years, just because of the impact, if you will. My vulnerability research bet, and this is a longer shot, I think, is that we will all be, vulnerability researchers will all be using agentic AI systems to find vulnerabilities within the next 5 years. So I think for the next couple of years, we're going to be playing whack-a-mole with researchers using AI vulnerability research platforms to push back the tide of AI slop code and the results of reckless vibe coding, which is, we're going to see a slight upsurge in that kind of vulnerability, I think. But then once the low-hanging fruit has been guzzled up by bug bounty hunters and all these sort of semi-automated or agentic systems, I think we'll settle into a world where these agentic tools that help increase bug bounty and vulnerability research capability of humans will become used in the way that we use traditional SAST and DAST tools today, so static analysis and dynamic analysis security tools today. So I think it's just like within the next 5 years, that's going to be a thing that we are considering a matter of routine, I think.
Awesome. I feel like we could dive into those for another half an hour, but I shan't, because we have just time for, I think, for one question before we wrap up. So we've got a question in from Chris, which is, if you could redesign the cyber ecosystem, crikey, if you could redesign the cyber ecosystem, whether that's regulation, incentives, norms, or technology, which one thing would you change or set up differently? Andy, I'll come to you first on that. Or Chris, whoever.
So I think not differently, but try pushing harder earlier to introduce the kind of formalized vulnerability disclosure platforms for companies, because I think that's one of the big things that's improved the efficiency of vendors when it comes to mitigating bugs. So if we could go back in time and kind of push for that much earlier, I think it would probably have resulted in many more bugs being patched more quickly than they were.
I'd add to that mandated red teaming against organizations above a certain size in the public interest, regulated in some way by government. I think that would be extremely effective. We see in our own consulting work that there are, essentially the bar needs to be raised, and I think that would be a very effective way of raising it. Of course, it would be a very large intervention, and I'm not sure there's the appetite for that. Obviously, all these interventions have a cost in economic terms, so perhaps that's me being too militant, but I've been a proponent for my entire career of improving your defense by breaking into things, and I think that's been shown to be effective. So, I guess I would say that, wouldn't I?
I mean, yeah, and there is a reason why more and more sectors are required to do that under regulation, right? Because it's being proved to be quite effective. I think if I was to answer that question, because I have the chair's prerogative, so I would say not write our cybercrime laws in 1990 and not update them for 35 years would be maybe my way of kind of turning back time. Maybe create some computer laws that could stand the test of time a bit better. But on that note, thank you both very much for joining us today, and thank you everyone online that's joined in or is watching the recording back on demand. Just to wrap up, as I say, we will circulate the recording of this webinar, so you can flick on to colleagues that might have missed it, or if you fancy rewatching it, you can. Equally, there's some resources up there on screen. So we have our research blog, a kind of summary of our 20 years of EPIC research that was published 5 years ago, and our GitHub, and also the vulnerability disclosure policy that we spoke about. But without further ado, thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed the session and have wonderful rest of days. Thank you.
Bye, folks.
Cheers.